And thank you for joining us, Ms. Judge. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me, and happy International Women's Day.
Indeed. I just wanted to start by looking at how you went about this study and what segment of the population you focused on here. Explain to me why we did it in this way.
So we looked at women in the 25 to 54 age range in full-time positions, and the reason why we did that is that that excludes any turnover related to early stages in careers or decisions around workloads around retirement ages. And we looked at full-time positions because that eliminates the impact of women being overrepresented in part-time roles where pay rates are lower.
Yeah, and one of the factors in the narrowing a wage gap is the workforce participation. We know that that's an important factor. So how clear of a correlation is there between the availability of daycare and the progress being made?
So there's very strong evidence that subsidized daycare and access to it increases women's participation in the labor market. You can look at Quebec, for example, which implemented subsidized daycare in the late 90s and now has the highest employment rate for young mothers. So there's very strong evidence that this is a factor, and it's very important for increasing women's representation in the labor market and therefore getting more years of experience. So when women do get further along in their careers and these executive positions open up, they do have more years of experience, which should filter into more women getting into executive types of roles.
Yeah, with that Quebec example, what does that tell you about how a federal daycare program could help narrow that gap even more?
Yeah, so access to subsidized daycare is certainly one of the factors that has been shown to increase women's participation in the labor market. So that's a very big factor in eventually closing the wage gap. There's still quite a big gap between men and women in terms of participation rates in the core working population. And we have seen the participation rate for women with young children increase since subsidized daycare programs have started to roll out across the country.
You talk about really narrowing that gap. How long do you think it'll take to finally eliminate the wage gap if this trend continues?
So I think we're moving in the right direction. One of the things that is stalling the closing of the wage gap is the fact that women are going into jobs that are actually male dominated. So those jobs have higher wage gaps to start with. They're higher paying positions, but they're just starting with bigger gaps. So as women continue to go into these fields, the wage gaps should continue to close. And we're seeing in the education pipeline, good news, women have surpassed men in terms of their likelihood to have a master's degree or a PhD. So that's a relatively recent development, which will take time to show up in the data. So it is just a bit of a waiting game.
Yeah, I want to talk about another part of there. You talked about the gap in the four highest jobs, and that continues to widen. What did you find in that sector?
So I think what you're seeing and what you described is the top tier management positions, executive type of roles. You have seen a widening of the gender pay gap. And part of that is due to the fact that women historically haven't had as much access to subsidized daycare and therefore haven't had as many years of experience in the workforce when these positions open up. That's obviously changing, and the generations coming up will have had access to that. And of course, it's also the role, or it's also men's job to recognize and promote women's talent where they see it so that women can share in these pay rewards equally as well.
But as we're seeing those numbers, it's actually getting wider at the top. So do you think that there's something that governments can do to help sort of bring it back in line with what you're seeing with the overall wage gap?
I think really the key factor is just getting more women into the labor market and getting more years of experience, particularly in higher paying roles. And I think that will filter through into the data. It's not something that will happen overnight. As I said, some of these educational developments are relatively recent. So it's the generations coming up are more likely to see a closing of the wage gap. But it, of course, is everyone's job to uplift women and promote talent where they see it.
Yeah, and I wanted to get back to that issue on the education. How can you explain how, even though women are, have more of a likelihood to hold a bachelor's degree than men, and more of a likelihood of a woman to hold a master's degree or a PhD, that is still sort of surpassing, all of the levels. So, how can we explain that women are more educated, yet that gap still remains there?
Yeah, one of the things is years of experience, and also those education figures mask some details under the surface that are important. Historically, women have gone in or studied things like humanities. More are going into the sciences now. More are going into fields that offer higher pay in the jobs market, and those things should also be associated with productivity gains for the economy, but it's simply just the time for that to filter through into the data. We just haven't seen the total effects of it quite yet, but everything seems to be in the pipeline.
Yeah, and hopefully that really does narrow sooner rather than later. Katherine Judge of CIBC Capital Markets, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.